The year was 1955. Dean Martin was the biggest star in America. His name was on marquees from Las Vegas to New York. Frank Sinatra called him the most naturally gifted entertainer alive. His records were on every radio station in the country. He had everything. And yet, on a Tuesday afternoon in October, he told his driver to take him somewhere he hadn't been in years. He said, "Take me back to Steubenville." Nobody on his team understood why. They were in the middle of a packed schedule, shows to rehearse, a film to prepare for, a television appearance that couldn't be moved. But Dean Martin, the man who had turned effortlessness into an art form, who made everything look easy, because to him most things were, was insistent in a way that the people around him rarely saw. He needed to go home, and he needed to find a family. Their name was Benedetto, and what they had done for him in the winter of 1926 was something he had never talked about publicly, never put in an interview, never mentioned from a stage. It was a private debt, the kind that doesn't appear in any ledger, but sits in the chest of a man who remembers what it felt like to be hungry and cold, and to have someone open a door and say, "Come in." To understand this story, you have to understand what Steubenville, Ohio looked like in the mid-1920s. It was a steel town on the Ohio River, hard and working class, and alive with the energy of people who had come from somewhere else to build something here. The Italian South End was its own world, a neighborhood of barbers and bakers and mill workers, of women who hung laundry from the same windows where they'd hung it in the villages they'd left behind across the Atlantic. The language in those houses was Italian, the food was Italian, the music was Italian, and the sense of community, the understanding that you watched out for the people on your block because nobody else was going to, was Italian too. Dean Martin, born Dino Paul Crocetti on June 7, 1917, grew up in this world. His father Gaetano was a barber. His mother Angela was everything else, the center of the household, the keeper of the language and the traditions and the warmth that made the small house on Garibaldi Street feel, despite its poverty, like somewhere worth being. But the Great Depression had other ideas about what a family's life should look like. By the winter of 1926, when Dino was 9 years old, the Crocetti family was in trouble. Not unusual trouble, the same trouble that was descending on Italian South End families all around them, as work dried up and the cold came in, and the money ran out faster than pride allowed anyone to admit. Gaetano's barbershop had fewer customers because nobody had money to spare. Angela stretched everything as far as it would go. But a 9-year-old boy is always hungry, and there were days that winter when being hungry was simply the condition of being alive in that house. The Benedetto family lived 3 doors down. Giuseppe Benedetto was a mill worker, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of man who expressed himself through what he did rather than what he said. His wife Maria was the opposite, voluble, warm, the kind of woman whose kitchen was never closed to anyone who needed it. They had 4 children of their own, ranging from 6 to 14. They had their own pressures, their own thin margins, their own calculations about how far the food would stretch. And yet Maria Benedetto fed young Dino Crocetti whenever he appeared at her door. It was never made into a ceremony. It was never announced or discussed or turned into something that would embarrass the Crocetti family by making the giving visible. It was simply food on a table, in a warm kitchen, available whenever the boy showed up. Soup in the winter, bread, whatever there was. Dino showed up often that winter. Maria never made him feel like charity. She made him feel like family. That was the thing about Italian South End in those years. The community absorbed its own suffering quietly, distributing what little there was according to need rather than formality. You did not ask your neighbor if they needed help. You simply helped. And you expected nothing in return except that when the wheel turned and you were the one in need, someone would be at the door. Dino Crocetti grew up. He dropped out of high school. He worked in the steel mills. He boxed under the name Kid Crochet and wrapped his hands without tape because tape cost money he didn't have. He dealt blackjack in speakeasies. He sang with local bands, billing himself as Dino Martini, and then he changed his name to Dean Martin. And then something happened that nobody in the south end of Steubenville had quite prepared for. The boy from Garibaldi Street became the most famous entertainer in America. He did it through a combination of talents so natural it barely seemed like talent at all, and charms so complete it functioned as its own kind of genius. His voice, that smooth, unhurried baritone that made even sad songs feel like an invitation to have another drink, was unlike anything the industry had heard. His timing was perfect. His ease was total. When Dean Martin walked into a room, the room reorganized itself around him. And through all of it, through the Las Vegas nights and the Hollywood films and the television specials and the Rat Pack and the Sands Hotel and everything that his name had come to mean to an entire generation of Americans who had never set foot in Steubenville, Ohio. Through all of it, he remembered Maria Benedetto's kitchen. He remembered what it had meant to be a cold, hungry 9-year-old boy and to have a door open. The report that reached him in 1955 came through a chain of connections, the kind of informal Italian-American network that still ran through the entertainment world in that era, linking the south end of Steubenville to the bungalows of Hollywood through cousins and old neighbors and men who had been boys together in the same cramped neighborhood. The report was simple and terrible. Giuseppe Benedetto had died, a heart attack, the previous spring. He had been 58 years old. Maria Benedetto was alone. The older children had moved away. The war and the post-war economy had scattered them, the way it had scattered so many families. The 2 younger ones were still in Steubenville, but they were struggling. Maria was living in the same house on the south end, the same house where she had fed Dino Crocetti soup on cold mornings nearly 30 years earlier. And she was doing so without Giuseppe's income, without the help of her scattered family, with a dignity so fierce that she had not asked anyone for anything. Dean Martin got in the car. He arrived in Steubenville on an October afternoon. The driver had barely pulled up to the house before Dean was out the door. Not performing, not doing the easy smile and the casual wave that was his public face, but moving with the particular focus of a man who has somewhere specific to be and something specific to do. Maria Benedetto answered the door. She was in her 60s now, her hair white, her hands thicker and more worn than they had been in the soup kitchen years of 1926. She looked at the man on her doorstep, and for a moment, just a moment, she didn't see Dean Martin the star. She saw Dino Crocetti the boy, the one who used to appear at her kitchen door with that particular combination of pride and hunger that Italian mothers recognized on sight. She said in Italian, "Dino, come in." He went in. What happened inside that house over the next several hours is known primarily through the accounts of the Benedetto children, who pieced it together from what their mother told them in the years that followed. Maria told them that Dean Martin had sat at her kitchen table, the same table, still in the same position, and eaten the food she put in front of him and talked to her the way a son talks to a mother when there is no performance required. He told her what he told very few people, that he remembered. That the winters in that house, the soup and the bread and the warmth and the absolute lack of ceremony about the giving, that it had stayed with him. That on the days in his early life when nothing was working, when he was still Kid Crochet, getting his hands torn up because he couldn't afford tape, when he was dealing blackjack at 4 a.m. to men who had more money than they knew what to do with. On those days, the memory of Maria Benedetto's kitchen had been one of the things that reminded him that kindness was real, that it existed in the world, that someone had extended it to him without being asked. He told her that he intended to repay it. Maria Benedetto tried to refuse. This was expected. This was correct. The Italian South End did not accept charity gracefully, and Maria Benedetto least of all. She was from a generation and a culture in which accepting help was a transaction that required careful navigation, in which the dignity of the receiver mattered as much as the generosity of the giver. Dean Martin understood this. He was from the same culture. He didn't offer her charity. He offered her family. The arrangement he made was handled quietly, through lawyers and through the same informal network that had brought him the news of Giuseppe's death. What is documented is what the Benedetto family has said publicly over the years, in interviews given to journalists and community historians who have pieced together this story. Maria Benedetto's house was paid for, the mortgage retired, the taxes arranged, the repairs that had been accumulating for years since Giuseppe's death addressed. She would not have to worry about losing it. The two younger Benedetto children, a son in his mid-20s and a daughter who was 20, were given opportunities. The son received funding to complete a trade certification that he had been unable to afford. The daughter received support to attend nursing school, a path she had wanted to take for years and could not access on the family's income. Both of them built stable, dignified lives from those starting points. And Maria Benedetto received every Christmas until she died in 1971, a package from Los Angeles. It contained money, enough to make the year comfortable, not enough to make her feel like a project. It contained a card, handwritten in Italian, and it always contained, according to the family, a note that said some version of the same thing. Thank you for the soup. Dean Martin did not publicize any of this. He was not constitutionally inclined to talk about his kindness. He was constitutionally inclined to deflect such conversations with a joke and a raised glass and a change of subject. The story of Maria Benedetto's kitchen and what he did 30 years later did not appear in any interview he gave during his lifetime. It appeared in the memories of the Benedetto family, in the accounts they gave to the Steubenville Herald-Star, in the way that stories travel through Italian-American communities, slowly, carefully, with the weight of something that was real and that the people who witnessed it did not want to see diminished by being told casually. Dean Martin paid for the first cancer center at St. John Hospital in Steubenville after his mother Angela died. He donated to his old Boy Scout troop. He bought band uniforms for Steubenville Catholic Central with Frank Sinatra. He gave money to the Italian Women's Club and came home for Dean Martin Day in 1950 and rode in the parade and visited children with disabilities at the city school. He was, by every account, a man who remembered where he came from and who had been there when he was struggling and who honored those debts quietly and persistently for the rest of his life. But the Benedetto story is different from the public donations and the hospital wings and the charity dinners. It is different because it was not about institutions. It was about a woman who had opened a door to a cold, hungry child and asked nothing in return. That is the category of debt that most people never repay. Not because they are ungrateful, but because the creditor never presents the bill. Maria Benedetto never asked Dean Martin for anything. She had not asked when he was 9. She would not have asked when she was old and Giuseppe was dead and the house needed fixing. This is the part of Dean Martin's life that the Las Vegas mythology misses. The smooth operator, the glass of scotch, the unflappable cool, that was real, and it was magnificent, and it is why his image still sells, and his songs still play, and his name still means something 60 years after his prime. But underneath the effortlessness was a man who had been poor enough to know what cold felt like, who had been hungry enough to know what generosity tasted like, and who carried both of those memories with him through every single room, in every single place his talent took him. He never forgot the soup, and on a Tuesday afternoon in October 1955, he drove back to Steubenville to say so. If this story moved you, If it reminded you of someone who helped you when they didn't have to, who opened a door when they could have kept it closed, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more stories about the artists who are more than their performances. And leave a comment. Have you ever gone back to thank someone who helped you when you had nothing? Because that is the hardest thing to do, and it is the most important. There is something worth saying about why Dean Martin never told this story himself. Not as a biographical mystery, but as a window into the kind of man he actually was beneath the performance. Dean Martin spent his entire public life cultivating the impression that nothing really touched him. The glass was always raised, the smile was always easy, the jokes were always ready. He had constructed with enormous deliberate skill a persona that said, "I am having a wonderful time, everything is fine, nothing costs me anything." This was, of course, a performance. All the most convincing performances are. The people who knew him best, Jerry Lewis, Frank Sinatra, his children, the musicians who worked alongside him for decades, spoke consistently about a different person underneath, a man who was quieter than his public self, more serious, more private, more deeply affected by loss and loyalty than the Las Vegas mythology would suggest. His son, Dean Paul Martin, died in 1987, killed in a plane crash. The loss destroyed him in ways that he could not construct a performance around. He withdrew from public life. He stopped working. He sat in his house on Mountain Drive in Beverly Hills, and he did not recover, not really, for the rest of his life. He died on Christmas Day 1995, and by most accounts, he had been dying slowly from the inside since the day the telegram about his son arrived. This is the man who drove back to Steubenville in 1955. Not the entertainer, not the king of cool, the boy from the South End who had learned in Maria Benedetto's kitchen that kindness was real, that people looked after each other, that when the cold came and the food ran out and the pride made it impossible to ask, someone would notice and someone would open a door. He had built his entire public life around the appearance of not needing anything from anyone. But the private life, the part that didn't appear in headlines or interviews or the carefully managed mythology, that life was organized around debts, around the people who had been there when he was nobody, around the specific, unrepeatable acts of ordinary human generosity that had kept him moving forward through the years when moving forward was not guaranteed. The Benedetto family kept the letters. They kept the Christmas cards. They kept the records of what had been done for Maria and her children. And they kept them privately, the way Italian families keep important things, not for display, not for reputation, but because they belonged to the story of who they were and where they had come from, and what had been exchanged in a kitchen on a cold morning in 1926. When Maria Benedetto died in 1971, one of her daughters arranged for a mass to be said for her at the church in the South End. The mass card listed her surviving family. It did not list Dean Martin. He was not there. But he had been there in the way that mattered. He had been there in October 1955, when the house needed fixing and the children needed futures, and the widow of a mill worker was sitting in a kitchen that had once fed a hungry boy who grew up to be the most famous entertainer in America. He had sat at that table. He had eaten the food she put in front of him, and he had said, "Thank you," in Italian, in the language that both of them had carried from childhood, in the words that meant exactly what they said, without any of the performance that the rest of his life required. That is the real Dean Martin. Not the Rat Pack, not the Sands, not the glass of scotch held at the precise angle that suggested he was never entirely serious about anything. The real Dean Martin was the boy who remembered the soup, and the man who went back 30 years later to make sure the woman who had given it to him would never be cold again. The Great Depression tested every family in the South End of Steubenville. Most of them got through it the same way, by looking out for the person next door, by stretching the food further than it was supposed to go, by pretending not to notice when pride and hunger were fighting each other on the face of a child at the door. They did this without fanfare, without any expectation of return. They did it because it was what you did in the South End, in that community, in those years. It was the only social safety net that existed when every other net had failed. Dino Crosetti was the beneficiary of that net, and Dean Martin never forgot it. Not when he was signing autographs, not when he was filming movies with Jerry Lewis, not when he was standing on the stage of the Sands Hotel in a tuxedo, with a glass in his hand and 1,500 people laughing at everything he said. That was the boy from the South End.